my experience, for example, with case Western, in which I spent 4 years, was not as easy in terms of establishing collaboration. It's never easy to establish collaboration between clinical and the basic world. And it took me 4 years in Cleveland to set up collaboration with Al Walden. It was really a very, very slow process. So here, I'm happy to report I'm here only a year and a half, and we're already running at least 4 different projects, which is unbelievable. It's really rare. But I would like to go back a few years back. You probably don't remember, in 1992 when I got my PhD and I sent 5 letters about postdoctoral positions, one of them was sent here to you. Unfortunately, I got turned down at that time, and I ended up with this alum in Pittsburgh. But after all these years, I came back, and then we interacted with Dr. Cain a number of ways, and actually it was really a real pleasure to interact with the MUSTT basic science community. So Dr. Cain's leadership in basic science work was well recognized on a number of levels. So I'm very happy to have you here in Cardiac Biotech Research Center as a presenter. Also, it is interesting when I look at your CV, which is extremely impressive. It was really rare to see how faithful you were to this institution for all these years. So after getting your undergraduate degree from Gettysburg College and your MD from George Washington University. So essentially every step, with some 2 years exception, you spent here from very early stages to present point. And I think it's really unusual in today's world. So without further ado, please.
Thank you, Igor, and good afternoon to everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to be here and a collaboration that is particularly magic in the environment that we live in the United States, to have the expertise at this university, which is why we all do stay here, because it is special and allows special people with diverse backgrounds with a common goal to work together and be more productive. The presentation that I was asked to talk about a little bit was risk stratification for sudden cardiac death, and it's appropriate, I think, and marries very nicely biomedical engineering, electrical engineering, basic science, electrophysiology, and clinical cardiology, and clinical cardiac electrophysiology. And I don't think anyone is going to disagree that reduction in death because of ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation is desirable, and to be successful at it, 2 things have to happen. You need to have an effective way to identify those people who will be at risk for developing these arrhythmias, and then one needs effective therapy. Both those things have to happen to achieve the ultimate goal. Most of my comments are going to focus on the clinical situation of ischemic heart disease and healed myocardial infarction. This is the animal and the human model that we'll go ahead and talk about. And so when you look at what happens to the ventricle in response to the injury caused by a myocardial infarction, and now you're in the healing or healed and the remodeling or remodeled phase of that biologic event, then in bold strokes it's clear that that remodeling and healing process in some individuals creates an anatomic electrophysiologic substrate that's conducive primarily to reentry. And there are other individuals in which that substrate may be partially created, but needs some kind of cofactor that is important in activating that substrate. And that cofactor could be lots of different things. It could be another bout of ischemia. It could be triggers such as spontaneous ectopy. It could be alterations in autonomic tone. It could be problems with repolarization. And there are lots of different things that could be electrolyte abnormalities that are important to activate that. So when one looks at how do you achieve the first portion of the need, which is to accurately identify people at risk, the method or the methods that are employed, just focusing on ischemic heart disease, needs to at least take into account a large number of possibilities and a spectrum that you have to deal with. The electrophysiology community has never been shy, and so we have had over the last 25 years very profound champions of the magic test that would accurately identify all people at high risk and accurately identify those people who would be at low risk. And this is several, but still not all of them. But they include attempts to look for triggers, ventricular premature depolarizations, repetitive forms, multiform, complex forms of ventricular ectopy, and so one can do that with ambulatory monitoring. One can look at heart function and the amount of scar tissue, which is reflected then in the measurement of the extent of damage, and is reflected in the left ventricular ejection fraction. One can look at the effects of increased sympathetic tone, increased heart rate, and the risk for residual ischemia by doing stress testing. One can look at occult delayed activation using high-resolution electrocardiography, looking for late potentials with the signal average DCG. A variety of ways to look at spontaneous, very low-level variances in autonomic tone using heart rate variability, heart rate turbulence, baroreceptor sensitivity, repolarization abnormalities, both occult using T-wave alternans or gross using QT dispersion, and one can do invasive studies and look at inducibility of ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation using program stimulation. And I suspect that there'll be more that's added to this list as time goes on. So the real world is that if you have these tests, how in fact do they perform? And do they accurately identify those at risk and accurately identify those who are not at risk? This slide is an old one and dates back to studies, prospective studies that were done in the 80s and early 90s that looked at a couple of these different tests in nice studies prospectively of where each test by itself could then be measured to see how well it performed. And what this slide shows, and it's actually the same if you looked at the additional tests shown on the previous slide, it's a very similar message. That if the test is normal, then the negative predictive power is pretty good. The downside of all of these, when one does a single test by itself, is that the positive predictive accuracy is not sufficiently high to allow you to prescribe an intervention based on that one test alone. That's true whether you use the signal average DCG, so if it's normal, very few of those patients go on and develop sustained ventricular tachycardia. If it's abnormal, about 20% go on and develop it, but it means that 80% don't. The same is true with Holter monitoring, looking for complex ectopy, heart rate variability, and even the response to program stimulation. And I want to just focus for a moment on ejection fraction because I'll come back to ejection fraction because it, in 2006, is the keystone. It is the one that clinically, if I wear my stethoscope and my cardiology hat, I am now making decisions on whether to implant or not implant a defibrillator now based on one variable, that's the ejection fraction, and totally ignoring the previous slide, which listed many other tests that have some predictive value. And I'll come back to this, where we've really taken one step backwards, if you will, as a result of some of the clinical trials that I'm going to briefly go over. So the problem with the single factor is that it has a good negative predictive accuracy, but a poor positive predictive accuracy. This becomes important, and I'm going to jump ahead for 1 minute and then come back to the data that shows that ICD therapy is in fact effective, because as one looks at if you did have effective therapy and you were basing your decision to use this therapy in patients and you don't have a very good risk stratifier, then you either end up not putting it in people who would benefit, or you end up implanting or implementing or using the therapy in a larger number of people who don't actually need it. And this slide simply looks at an economic factor, which is the incremental cost effectiveness for a year of life saved, with a lot of interventions that are used in cardiology, CABGs, using antihypertensives, using statins to reduce low cholesterol, or to reduce high cholesterol and lower the cholesterol. And interspersed in here is the dollar amount per life year saved based on using a ICD, primarily based on that one factor, which was whether someone has a certain level for an ejection fraction. The economists in the world tell us that if it costs $135,000 for life saved, it's economically unattractive. These interventions are felt to be expensive. These are borderline, and these are cost effective. So what we're currently doing, which is to take the ejection fraction and make that as the decision point as far as who gets an implantable defibrillator, is costing somewhere between about $40,000 and $45,000 per life year saved. So it's an economic burden that we pay every year when we pay taxes, and the government has to deal with the Medicare and Medicaid budget. So what can one do, and what has the field done, given the fact that we have lots of single risk stratification methods? All have some advantages, but all have some disadvantages. We now have an effective therapy, which is the implantable defibrillator, and if we continue on our current course on relying on a single factor, we're going to have ever-escalating healthcare bills. So the field has taken two approaches. One is to assume that that very first slide that I showed, which is some people have an anatomic electrophysiologic substrate, some have a partial substrate that requires a variety of cofactors, and then we have a variety of risk stratifying tests that have been championed to help risk stratify, that the message is simple. This is not a single test problem. It's a complex disease, and one is going to have several tests, and one will have a risk index based on several different factors, and maybe that would do better in preserving the power of its good negative predictive accuracy and improve the positive predictive accuracy. So there are data, again, from the older literature that support that approach. So this table summarizes, again, studies done in the 80s and early 90s, prospective studies, that looked at how well using some of these approaches in combination worked. And did they, in fact, by using them in combination, preserve the negative predictive accuracy that one had when they were used alone, but increase the positive predictive accuracy. And as shown here, that ends up to be supported by using these tests in combination. So in each of these, the negative predictive accuracy is maintained, and the positive predictive accuracy, instead of being 17, 20, 22%, is somewhere in the 30s, 40s, and maybe as high as 50, depending on how many of these things that you want to use in combination. A couple breakthroughs that help in looking at more recent studies that were designed to both test a risk stratifier as well as therapies to see how well these work together. The previous studies simply looked at risk, but there was no intervention to try to reduce that risk. And it wasn't really until the 90s and the turn of the century that we had prospective studies that had by design both goals. How well does something risk stratify, and how well do therapies based on that risk impact the outcome of the patient? So I'm going to spend just a few moments on three of these studies and use them just to remind you about what the major impact was clinically, but also use them for evidence and support that there's other ways that one may think about going to try to improve risk stratification. So the first of these was a trial called MUSTT, and it involved the enrollment of a little over 2,000 patients. And the beauty of the study was that it incorporated people that had multiple risk factors. So you had to have an infarct, heel infarct. You had to have a low ejection fraction. You had to have complex ventricular ectopy defined as episodes of self-terminating ventricular tachycardia. And they added two more risk stratifying approaches to that pool of patients. One was to do invasive program stimulation to see if inducibility was an important risk factor, and the other was to use the signal average electrocardiogram. So you got, in many patients, 5 different risk factors built into the system. And then from a therapy point of view, they identified a group, and here the linchpin was inducibility, that if you were not induced, you were treated with current state-of-the-art medicines, ACE inhibitors and beta blockers. And if you were induced into sustained ventricular tachycardia, you were randomized to aggressive therapy using drugs, and if drugs didn't work, the use of a defibrillator, as well as optimal medical management, or you were randomized to just optimal medical management. So it was actually a very well-designed study.
It's 2,002 patients, right?
Right. So about a third were inducible, and 2/3 were not. But within both of these groups, they all had infarcts, they all had low ejection fraction, they all had non-sustained ventricular tachycardia. Most of them had program stimulation, and most of them had the signal average DCG. So I'm going to take a minute and just look at the difference between this group and this group. So this was the high-risk group because they had an infarct, low ejection fraction, non-sustained ventricular tachycardia, and inducible sustained arrhythmias, and they were randomized to 2 different treatments. And this was the outcome with months of follow-up on this axis and the event rate, which was arrhythmic death or cardiac arrest on this one. The group that was at high risk but randomized to optimal medical therapy is shown by the orange line, and the outcome of these patients was no different than the outcome of the patients that had the same characteristics other than they were treated with aggressive antiarrhythmic drugs based on invasive electrophysiology study. And then the best group to be in was this high-risk group. They were all the same as far as the risk factors, except the medical intervention was implantation of an implantable cardioverter defibrillator. So this was a dramatic change in the outcome compared to these 2 groups. And it reinforced that despite optimal medical background management, one could still improve outcome further by using a device, and that using the best antiarrhythmic drugs that were available at the time made no difference. So it was one nail in the coffin that antiarrhythmic drugs were not helpful in preventing sudden death, and it was the first positive sign that the defibrillator may be the second part of the magic equation, which is if you identify people at risk, there's now a therapy that may have a beneficial outcome. The downside of MUSTT was the expectation that this group, which had an infarct, non-sustained VT, low ejection fraction, but were not induced into a sustained arrhythmia, would in fact do very well and do much better than either this group or this group, and particularly this group. So that outcome is shown in this slide, and this was the group that was supposed to do very well. Lots of risk factors, but no inducible arrhythmias, compared to lots of risk factors, including inducible arrhythmias. And although there was a significant difference between these groups, and the hypothesis was in fact supported, this was not a great group to be in. There were still lots of deaths, arrhythmic death and cardiac arrest, even though you were not inducible, meaning that inducibility identified a few people, but the fact that you were not induced still meant that you were at relatively high risk for a lethal event. The second was a trial called MUSTT-2, which was a simpler trial. It took people with healed infarcts, low ejection fractions, didn't care whether they had ectopy or not, and didn't care whether or not they had an EP stent. So the old infarct, low ejection fraction. Therapies were simple, a defibrillator or optimal medical management with ACE inhibitors and beta blockers, and the outcome again demonstrated that a defibrillator had a favorable impact on outcome compared to optimal medical therapy. So it showed that you could risk stratify in bold strokes using ejection fraction, and that again confirmed that there may be an effective therapy that when used in the right group of patients would in fact have a favorable impact on outcome. And then the third trial was one that was released a little over a year and a half ago, called Sudden Cardiac Death and Heart Failure. And it included both patients with ischemic heart disease, like MUSTT and MUSTT, but also included patients who had non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, heart muscle damage from things other than coronary artery disease. It had the same simple design, where what got you into the trial was a low ejection fraction, and if you had a low ejection fraction, you were put on optimal background medical management, ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, and then one group in addition received amiodarone, another group was treated with a placebo, and the third group received a defibrillator. And the outcome again was supportive of the other two trials. The risk of death is high, even on optimal medical management, and that of these interventions, amiodarone, optimal medical management, or defibrillator, the defibrillator had a favorable impact compared to the other two. So pretty convincing evidence that in 2006, that effective therapy can in fact occur with the use of a defibrillator, that antiarrhythmic drugs, primary old and new antiarrhythmic drugs, had no favorable impact and were really no different than optimal medical management. Now, let me go back to MUSTT and then look at whether or not we should continue down the pathway of basing our decisions on MUSTT-2 and SCUD-F, which says all you need to do is measure the ejection fraction. If it's low, put in a defibrillator. It's expensive, it's going to increase our taxes a little bit, but you have a favorable impact on outcome. Or whether there's some other information that we can extract from these trials that would tell us that we should use more studies in combination, or even look harder to evolve risk stratification methods and ask the question whether or not the ones that we have, even though there's a long list, are they really sensitive to the basic biology that is integral to the development of ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. So if you remember with MUSTT, and here I'm going to pick on high-resolution electrocardiography and the signal average ECG. And with MUSTT, you had low ejection fraction, infarcts, non-sustained ventricular tachycardia, programmed stimulation, and also many patients had a signal average ECG. And so the design of MUSTT also lets you go back and see whether other risk factors, in this instance, the signal average ECG, would help separate out a low-risk group and a high-risk group. And the best group of patients in MUSTT to use to answer that question is this group, because they received no intervention other than optimal background therapy, and this group, which also just received optimal medical background therapy. So if one just looks at the signal average ECG in that group, and these were individuals who had monomorphic sustained ventricular tachycardia and who had a narrow QRS complement, so excluded MUSTT patients who had paced rhythms or who had interventricular conduction delays defined as left bundle branch block, right bundle branch block, or non-specific interventricular conduction problems. They looked at individuals who had a QR restoration less than 120 milliseconds. Then in that group, inducibility had no predictive power to identify a high-risk group, whereas the signal average ECG did for both arrhythmic death or cardiac arrest or cardiac death overall. And in fact, the signal average ECG, when compared to inducibility, or when inducibility was compared to signal average ECG, the signal average ECG actually won the race. So if you were inducible but had a normal signal average ECG, you did well. On the other hand, if you had an abnormal signal average ECG and you were not inducible, you did poorly. And that these were independent risk stratifiers and were not related, not surprisingly, indicating that they may in fact be measuring something different. So that led us to, and this was simply the Kaplan-Meier curve, that if you looked at that group of MUST patients that I described and simply looked at what was their outcome if their signal average ECG was normal or if it was abnormal, there was a significant separation, a hazard ratio of 1.87, and the separation was actually more powerful than one showed earlier on with inducibility. So that led us to then start to look at whether the traditional way of obtaining the signal average ECG, which was to record beats in sinus rhythm, average them to reduce the noise, and interrogate the very terminal portion of the QRS complex for the purpose of detecting microvolt occult delayed activation, which was thought to be emanating from tissue that would allow reentry to occur. And that was the classic definition of a late potential, and it was that approach and definition that was used in MUST and most of the other studies in which signal average electrocardiography has been used. But the whole window of biology that you're looking at is essentially right here at the end of the QRS complex. So back in the early 80s and 90s, the electrophysiology group here, which included Jim Cox as head of CT surgery, who was an arrhythmia surgeon, Peter Core, Frank Wikowski, Catherine, John Bueno, and others, Steve Pogwitz, all worked together to make a remarkable system at the time in 1983, was a 160-lead, three-dimensional, computerized, interoperative mapping system that could be used in humans to generate three-dimensional maps of activation during sinus rhythm or induced arrhythmias for patients who were undergoing heart surgery or arrhythmia surgery, primarily surgery for medically refractory ventricular tachycardia. And the approach that was developed was to use a needle that had electrodes that allowed one to record from the subepicardium to intramural sites and the subendocardium, and then not shown here, we also had a sock that could be put over the epicardium, and one could get true epicardial signals as well. This is, again, an old slide from the mid-80s, but is representative of the kinds of data and the conclusions that the data allowed one to come to using this system in patients who had healed myocardial infarctions and clinically had recurrent sustained ventricular tachycardia. So this is a intraoperatively generated isochronic map. The heart here is depicted as slices from the base of the heart down to the apex. Left ventricle is here, right ventricle on this side. The blackened area denotes the core infarct. What's shown on the top is the induction of the clinical tachycardia. So programmed stimulation is being performed from the right ventricle. This is the last beat of 8-beat pacing drive. 2 premature ventricular beats are then put in at critical coupling intervals and that set the stage for induction of sustained monomorphic ventricular tachycardia. The isochronic map then of the 7th and 8th beat of what would then be a very long run of ventricular tachycardia is shown here. And in this patient, the mechanism was reentry, and the reentry circuit was macro, it was intramural, and essentially went around the core infarct and had epicardial and subendocardial turnaround points, and it was very reproducible from beat to beat. The next slide simply shows a reduced schema of that macro reentrant circuit, and then representative electrograms from those needle electrodes that were simply placed along this reentrant circuit, just to make the point that it is continuous electrical activation with reactivation of site A again here, and in these patients we could account for millisecond by millisecond reentrant activation. So the issue was, if that's the tissue that is responsible for that patient's ventricular tachycardia, that's where the reentrant circuit is localized, then when during normal rhythm is that piece of muscle activated? Because if one wanted to interrogate signals from arrhythmogenic tissue, you'd like to know when during sinus rhythm that tissue activates. Does it activate during the terminal QRS and would be captured by looking at late potentials, or is some of it, or most of it, or all of it activated at other portions that no one was looking at the moment? So this was a study in the same group of patients, or another group of patients, there was some crossover, in which we were able then to map with the resolution shown in the previous 2 slides, as well as obtain maps during sinus rhythm before ventricular tachycardia was induced. And so this is a schematic just of a perfect sinus beat, P wave, QRS complex, J point, ST segment, and T wave. And then the vertical lines simply demarcate the onset of the QRS, the offset of the QRS, the last 40 milliseconds, which was where late potentials were typically sought when one interrogated that portion of the cardiac cycle. And then what's shown below here are the activations that were captured during sinus rhythm using the needle electrodes and the portions of the epicardium that were activated and captured and could be accounted for using the sock electrode. What's shown in red is when the tissue of that macro reentrant circuit actually activated, when those same electrodes that I showed you, A through A, and the rest of them in between, when did that tissue activate now during sinus rhythm? And as you can see, and this was true in most patients, most of that tissue activates during the major portion of the QRS, the early and the mid portion, and only a small portion of that tissue contributes to signals that make up the terminal QRS and ST segment. And in fact, when we looked at the number of patients that we had access to make these kinds of determinations, this was the case in most. Very little of that tissue contributed to the terminal QRS. All of these patients had traditional late potentials, but those late potentials were generated by surviving epicardium overlying the infarct, and the tissue generating those late potentials was spatially and temporally remote from the tissue that actually housed the reentrant circuit. So then this led our group, which was now forming, that includes Martin Arthur and others from his lab, and most recently Jason Trobow, to develop ways in which, instead of just interrogating the terminal portion of the QRS, can we start to analyze the cardiac cycle. And so we developed, using a standard Frank XYZ system at the time, or today, at the time it was pretty sophisticated, but today a pretty primitive way of recording XYZ leads and looking over the entire cardiac cycle. So this is a spectral plot of frequency and the magnitude statistically measured of the magnitude of the different frequencies. And this plot compares the magnitude of each of these frequencies from a group of patients who had a healed infarct whose clinical course had not been complicated by ventricular tachycardia, and from another group of patients who had a healed infarct whose clinical course had been complicated by ventricular tachycardia. And any part of this graph along this axis that is below or above the gray line indicates a significant difference in the magnitude of those frequencies. So in bold strokes over this range of 200 hertz, there was a pretty significant difference in very low frequency signals and a pretty substantial increase or difference in the p-value between these groups in an intermediate range of frequencies between about 13 and 56 hertz, and again another high frequency band between about 60 extending out to around 120 or 125 hertz. If one took these signals and then reconstructed them in the time domain to find out when did they occur, then they occurred not only during the terminal portion of the QRS, but occurred throughout the QRS complex, and particularly these low frequency signals between 1 to 7 hertz, not surprisingly, were a major component of the T wave, which again had not been looked at using traditional signal averaged time domain high resolution kinds of approaches. We also began to look at whether or not there was differences on where certain of these frequency bands were recorded or distributed on the body surface. And so in early days of body surface mapping, both with direct measurements as well as with estimates of where these distributions would be on the body surface, we found some interesting differences between patients with healed infarcts without ventricular tachycardia compared to the spatial distribution in patients who had healed infarcts, whose course over the 2 or 3 years following the infarct was complicated by the development of either ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. These graphs are isoharmonic maps, and one can either show the distribution of where either the peak or the valley that is distributed for any of those frequency bands of interest. This one happens to be the 1 to 7 hertz, that low frequency band, but similar differences in distribution could also be seen when one looked at the intermediate frequency band or at the high frequency band. For illustration purposes, the torso has been unrolled. So this is the mid-back, this is the right mid-axillary line, this is the sternum, the left mid-axillary line, and back to the back. And this simply shows the distribution of where the peak of that 1 to 7 hertz frequency band was located. And in the group without ventricular tachycardia, there was a fairly homogeneous distribution, whereas that distribution was more heterogeneous in people who ultimately developed ventricular tachycardia. So again, indicating to us that space may be important. And then if you use this as a roadmap, a biologic roadmap, instead of just measuring an X, Y, Z lead in everybody, knowing that my torso shape is different than yours and someone else's, could you go to this site and put an ECG lead right at that site in that patient and that site in that patient, and then see whether or not you amplified the differences in the spectral content of the cardiac cycle, then one saw differences. This is just another one showing if one took the minimum, that there's a fairly homogeneous distribution of the non-VTers, and as was true with the maximum, a heterogeneous distribution in those with ventricular tachycardia. But again, if I get back to the point of where in this patient I put an ECG lead driven by where the distributions of this frequency band is in this individual's chest, and go to this point and put an electrode for this individual, and then see whether or not you can record signals and then do an appropriate time or frequency analysis of that biologically driven ECG. one can amplify further the separation in spectral content between patients with and without ventricular tachycardia. So this simply compares three methods within this group of patients who have an infarct, who had ventricular tachycardia, in a group of patients who had an infarct, who didn't have ventricular tachycardia. They were measured using traditional true Frank leads, and then they were measured using an ECG at the maximum of one of those frequency bands. In this instance, it's the 1 to 7, and at the minimum of that 1 to 7. So three different ECG leads, if you will. The differences between the groups traditionally measured using the Frank leads for the purposes of this picture were zero. And what you're looking at is, was there additional separation within those patient groups by using, if you would, a biologic ECG rather than a traditional Frank XYZ lead. And so when one looked at the minimum, one increased the separation up to 20 dB overall over a relatively short frequency range. And if one looked at the maximum, one extended the power of separation by half to 1 to 2 dB over a broader range. So all of these things meant to us that if you wanted to record non-invasively signals generated by arrhythmogenic tissue, you weren't doing it with standard approaches at the time. That you were going to need more sophisticated approaches, and that you were going to have to increase the window of interrogation to not just the end of the QRS, but essentially the cardiac cycle. And that space was also a potential important factor that one would want to take advantage of, or could take advantage of, to better select and be able to preferably record from tissues of interest. So this is a histologic section taken from one of those patients that Jim Cox operated on, that we mapped using the approaches that I showed you. And this was the tissue that was removed after the infarct had been opened, the reentrant circuit identified, and the arrhythmogenic tissue in principle removed, and then some. This is one of the slices of the heart, which is where the core infarct was, and it was around this core infarct that the reentrant circuit revolved. This then is the endocardium from that site, and you can see there is extensive scar tissue, not surprisingly, from this healed and remodeled infarct, and that there is interdisposed within the scar tissue, in the dark colors, viable myocardial tissue. So this is a nasty mesh of scar tissue and surviving myocardium, and it's in this mesh here that all the appropriate anatomic electrophysiologic things that have to happen to allow reentry to occur do in fact occur. So as a risk stratifier, I would like to know the answer to the question that if this substrate exists in this person, and this person did in fact have spontaneous and inducible ventricular tachycardia, is there some special unique signature, electrical signature, that as this tissue activated during sinus rhythm, it gives off a marker that is different than someone who has an infarct that doesn't allow ventricular tachycardia to occur? And if I want to answer that question, I want to be able to place my electrodes, my extracellular electrodes, right over this arrhythmogenic tissue and not have it spoiled by tissue that's activating remotely. I want to be able to hone in and do something non-invasively to record or optimize my way of looking at signals generated as this particular tissue activates. So then that leads us to having work that we've done here locally over the last 10 to 15 years in building this process, and then makes a wonderful time for Igor and Yoram and this group to add their expertise as well. So the systems that have been developed and are being developed and then can be supplemented by the work that has gone on by the people who have come from Cleveland, the work that we have played with has been very similar to what has happened in Cleveland and elsewhere. To pull this off, you need to image the heart. You need to have an anatomically accurate way of looking at the heart. So one in 2006 can use magnetic resonance imaging, CT imaging, fluoroscopy, and ultrasound. And each has advantages and disadvantages, both from a resolution point of view, from a cost point of view, from a radiation exposure point of view, and lots of different points of view. The ones that seem the most likely to be helpful are going to be MR or CT. They're expensive and have some limitations. And ultrasound, which is cheap, portable, and can be done in everybody. So we have looked at ways to use both MR, but primarily ultrasound, as a way to get critical images of the ventricle that would help in more personalizing and individualizing the inverse solution so that one could better estimate epicardial potentials from the body surface. Through work that Martin and Jason have done in electrical engineering, and Julio Perez in our Echo Lab, satisfactory images can now be obtained using a laptop computer. One measures the individual body torso with a system called the immersion, which allows one very accurately to reconstruct an individualized torso. And through a custom calibration approach that Jason developed, one can accurately measure using the ultrasound probe and where that probe is on the heart torso, different depths within the chest to accurately create then using ultrasound images that bounce back to the transducer what the general anatomy of the ventricle and heart is. One can develop using the ultrasound probe and then seeing where it interacts with cardiac tissue. And we have fixed identifiable landmarks, the mitral valve, the aortic valve, and can accurately tell what the dimensions of the heart are using this, and use this approach then to essentially create different models of the heart. This was one that we used early on, called the complex whole method, and as one looked at this by creating this based on the ultrasound information, and then importantly to place this using body surface mapping, the immersion system, which not only measures the torso but accurately records where each of these body surface mapping electrodes is located on that torso, and then using the ultrasound probe and knowing where it is to get a pretty good estimate of an individualized heart torso model, and then using this to help solve better the inverse equation and be able then to estimate inferred epicardial ECG leads from regions of interest, defined again using ultrasound or MR, and then from these inferred potentials be able to do any kind of signal processing that one would want to do to interrogate whether signals coming from certain regions of the heart do in fact differ in their qualities that may help identify people better who are at risk. This just happens to be a very, very preliminary data that was actually acquired a couple of years ago from a few patients using this approach, and it's set up to that, similarly to that distribution that I showed several slides ago when we looked at populations of patients. Hertz is shown here, and then the probability or t-statistic is shown on this axis, and any point that is below or above this line indicates a significant difference. And so using this approach, it was in some ways comforting to find in very preliminary data, essentially 3 frequency bands that separate these groups, although much more crisply defined. A low frequency band, an intermediate frequency band, and a high frequency band. So this approach continues to evolve, and we're very anxious to learn and cooperate and collaborate to see whether or not together we can use these approaches with those that have been developed by others here in an effort to try to answer the question, are there unique signatures, are there unique signals that are generated by tissue that is likely to go on and develop ventricular tachycardia? Can you identify them and separate them? And does that in fact allow you to better predict people who are at high risk and people who are at low risk? And then finally, again, just to thank people who have spent time with Martin and I over what's now a long time, and most recently and currently includes Jason here in electrical engineering, Tim Smith in clinical cardiac electrophysiology, some people who helped us many years ago and have since left the institution, and we were all here between the main campus here in electrical engineering and at the medical school. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
And there was you listed a number of different tests, and I'm wondering if anybody has tried to put together any type of statistical model that would be more predictive, that would include not just that data, but also patient data such as hypertension, age, gender, race, just all these suspects to come up with obviously the data showed that these models are marvelous, just something that have better sensitivities and specificity.
Yeah, and as I said, the one step forward that we've taken is that ejection fraction works and the defibrillator has a favorable impact. The step backward that we've taken is that all of the current stuff is just focused on this subgroup of people who all you need to get into is a low ejection fraction. In the old Bob Meyerberg slide of who are the actual people that die suddenly and where do they, what bucket do they fit into? It is true that if you have a healed infarct and a low ejection fraction, a large percentage of those patients die suddenly. But most of the people who die suddenly don't have a low ejection fraction. They have an ejection fraction of 38%, 40%, 42%. And so, although if you have an ejection fraction of 48%, your risk of dying is less. But there's more people who have an ejection fraction of 48%, and so more absolute people will die because it's a bigger pool. So it's a long-winded answer to your question. When you look at that scope of things, then trying to look at other kinds of traditional risk factors, and that is hypertension, diabetes, then that hasn't been done. When you look at this, when people have gone back and looked at SCUD-HEF and MUSTT and made it 2, and then tried to see were there differences in age or gender, or if you had diabetes, or if you had hypertension, then nothing has fallen out. And part of that has been that the study wasn't powered enough to be able to absolutely tell that. So the long-winded answer is no, we don't know that.
Clinically, though, when you are evaluating a patient, you got somebody who's kind of sitting on the edge, whether or not you can put an ICD and the patient's, somebody's got diabetes, obese, is 80 years old. Does that sway your opinion?
Oh, yeah. So the only thing that sways it is the likelihood that there'll be some other major event in the person's life over the next couple of years, because the data only show that this impact is for up to 60 months. I mean, this is not 10 years worth. So comorbidities that would result in death from other causes. And then there's the social issue about the person has Alzheimer's disease or whatever.
Right.
Those things, and in fact, the CMS guidelines have actually helped because they're written to say that if you have these risk factors, it is recommended or shown, it's written so legally one can say, yes, the data support this, but I have a way out if the feeling was that this was not going to be effective.
And one more question. All the data shows drugs performing absolutely dismally. In fact, even almost some of these curves suggest worse than placebo. So do you have you guys clinically discontinued use antiarrhythmic drugs?
No, because they do work in some. And so what the shift has been that you're no longer prescribing them to save somebody's life. You're prescribing them as palliative therapy to make things better. So one of the disasters clinically is to put a device in somebody and have them have every 3 days an episode of BF or BT and they're shocked, or they keep passing out and then they're shocked. And so by giving them a drug, even though it may be pro-arrhythmic in some ways, it may increase the interval between episodes. So now they have an episode every 6 months. And that's progress, as opposed to having therapy having to be given, every few days.
I have several questions. One is a practical question. I remember many years ago, when I came to Lewin Clinic and I was interviewed with faculty members. First person to interview was Mina Chong. She just came from here actually. It was like 6 months before I came. And we talked about the data issue. And I was curious at that time, and I'm still curious. We talked to Rick about it a little bit, but is there any way we can get our hands on the data? Are they still available? So in particular, this is really unique data. I don't know if you can get data like that.
Does that old data card still work?
Well, I'm not. We're about ready to throw it out. We have the tapes. We
so
kept
it's still available.
It's still available.
Yeah, we probably can. Is it the PDP 11 format?
No, it's the data is all on these big tapes.
Ampex tapes.
Ampex tapes.
So is there any hardware?
The hardware is still there. It was still there when we looked at it.
That's FX tape.
No, it's digital. It's digital. When it worked
Yeah.
fine. It was a great recording.
We still have the tapes, and there may still be a recording system that would have to be repaired and updated.
That's awesome.
But we have the data.
It's a unique data set.
Yeah.
In particular, my personal interest is that we're conducting a study on essentially similar setup, but in an animal model, of course. In dogs, we create function and use in people with tachycardia. Unfortunately, like humans, we have to use flecainide to sustain it.
Right.
But in general, it follows the same scenario, and we would like to look at the following. So when you conducted the study, you induced VT in patients, and you mapped it. What do you do when you go to terminate? How do you terminate?
The VT. Just most of the time we were able to pace terminate them.
So it was ATP, like
most of the time, yeah.
This will be really interesting. And another totally unrelated question. Just a few months ago, we had a great lecture here by Peter Schwartz, and he talked about long QT syndrome, and essentially his idea of having a wide-scale screening of newborns. And in his preliminary data shows that in this patient population, which we studied, incidence can be as high as 1 in 2,000.
Right.
So do you think it's economically justifiable to do this on really whole population, large quantities? This kind of thing?
As far as genetic testing for
But also ECG
inherent,
testing.
the ECG testing,
Brought
yeah, that's been looked at. So it's the same thing. With Italy has a national health policy of where every person that goes to school, if they want to play sports, and I think it's certainly at the high school, it may even go down to the junior high level, gets an ECG. And then in this country, this subject flares every time an athlete dies suddenly, they say. And then those numbers have actually been looked at, and I don't want to misquote, but it is an astronomical cost to equip high schools and colleges and elementary schools with ECG machines, and then the people to record them, and then someone to interpret them. So you think it would be a very small amount of money. When you look at the total number of kids, it depends on where you want to draw the line. Is it every kid, or is it every child who's going to participate in some kind of contact sport or any kind of sport that has a sudden burst of certain activity? So it's doable, but it is remarkably and surprisingly expensive.
So what is the cost of that? I'm sorry.
The Boston group actually looked at that. They wrote I think this was an editorial in the journal Captain Jenkins, John Price, looking at the cost per patient for infant ECG screenings for SIDS. The peak incidence of sudden infant death is about 1 to 3 months, where you'd expect the pulmonary vascular resistance to be changing, ductal closure movement. So it's not too surprising that most of the deaths are centered around that time interval. The corrected QT interval in newborn infant up to 490 is considered normal. So the repolarization and transition is a very strange thing. It's hard to measure. It's hard to come up with statistical norms. And they came out with some incredible numbers, I think 180,000 life saved or something insane like that. And the number of kids you'd have to submit to, confirmatory echocardiography, serial ECG follow-ups, Holter, you'd probably be better off taking a gene-based approach where you send a blood sample to the company and just said, probe this for SCN5A123. That would work out better than a functional test like these.
So what is the policy about reimbursement for ECG screening? Because I remember a few years back, I decided to do a physical, and I went to doctor's office, and I realized that I'm teaching already how to record ECG and what it means for a number of years, but I've never taken my own ECG in my entire life. So I asked him to take my ECG, and I was told that, well, you're not 40 yet, so therefore, we don't do that. And I really felt that there's some kind of resistance. I'm not sure what exactly it means in terms of reimbursement.
Yeah, well, see, so here the federal government doesn't care because you're under 65, so they're not paying for it. And it depends on what your HMO managed care plan allows, and they're all different as far as at what age you can justify screening ECG and actually have it paid for. So Blue Cross is different than United Healthcare, which is different than the next country. So it varies.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I found out that 9% of my systems are ventricular last time I had one.
Catherine.
I was interested in your very first slide showing the kind of the substrate itself, and then this additional groups where you have some maybe second hit. And I was just curious as to what your thoughts on this were. How many of the arrhythmias and sudden deaths occur from that true group of substrate alone, or is it mostly, a second hit that's involved in?
Well, I can look at it two ways. So in the healed infarct, and where the estimate comes from is, and so when you take people who have a healed infarct and they've clinically had monomorphic ventricular tachycardia, then my experience when I used to be in the EP lab, in those patients you could induce ventricular tachycardia with just putting in a coupling, and you played with the coupling intervals and you simply found that magic interval and you could initiate that. So I estimate then that in these people who were on Versed and they were comfortable, their blood pressure was fine, their blood oxygen level was fine, they weren't anxious, and all I was doing was 220 versus 240. And reproducible, that group has a substrate and requires very little cofactors other than the magic interval in which two back-to-back beats occur at that interval. When you start looking at ventricular fibrillation, it's a different substrate. The partial substrate may be there, but I think it's much more likely that you need cofactors to have the initial rhythm, essentially the polymorphic VT that generates it. And then once you get into the non-ischemic myopathies, then I have no. Well, I can estimate because when we used to study those, the inducibility rate was much less, and so I think more of it is a cofactor that is important in that process.
I guess my question is aimed more at knowing what you know about the efficacy of the testing. So if you just think about everyone who's out there and people who have the substrate, who have MIs, who have scars or not, are they relatively stable as the next guy who, may have, not have as large a scar or may not even have a scar, and doesn't really take a trigger in all of those patients?
Yeah, so I think with a healed infarct, then my own feeling of it is that it's luck of the draw. There's a trigger that happened today that didn't happen yesterday, and then for the others, the non-ischemics and the BFs, I think it's much more complicated. Yes.
With signal averaging, even T-wave alternates have a pretty good negative predictive value at least. What do you think have been the barriers to the adoption of these in the clinical world and more widespread world?
One has been the failure to do the right study, which is to say we're going to make the decision point whether this test is normal or abnormal. And of course, the environment right now is very good for that because you're putting more defibrillators in than you need. So set up the trial where you prospectively design it that the signal average DCG will be the predictor. And at the end, we're going to see how many ICD discharges occurred in the group that had an abnormal signal average versus a normal. And you'll be pretty good. Some of the ICD discharges will still be discharges of non-sustained arrhythmias that would have stopped with 2 more beats, but the defibrillator said, I can't stand this any longer, so I'm going to do something. But in big strokes, I think it would be okay. There is a study in which that's happening using T-wave alternans, and Dave Rosenbaum at Cleveland is running that. That's called the ABC-D or ABC trial, where it's prospectively designed to test T-wave alternans. From an economic point of view, it may be forced on us sooner than we would otherwise want without definitive proof. There is a study that will be published, I think, in the next issue. It didn't come out in the first issue of the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, but it's coming out, I think, in the second issue this month of January or early February. And it even made the newspapers of where T-wave alternans was good in its positive predictive thing, that if it was abnormal, then there was a high likelihood that the defibrillator would be used. And CMS has even, through secondhand talk, even suggested that it may want people to have this T-wave alternans test. And they haven't gone so far to say that if it's normal, you can't put a defibrillator in. And they won't do that because the data aren't yet that strong. But I think it's coming that way. So it's a good environment right now to do these trials because we have the backup. 10 years ago, it was an ethical problem, and that was, I don't believe the signal average DCG is better than program stimulation. So I refuse to enroll a patient in which a decision not to treat with anything is going to be based on signal average DCG. Now you're going to put a defibrillator in most of these people, and we have a magic window to find out either alone, new tests, or in combination old tests, actually.
Okay, well, thank you very much.